Think the Middle Ages were brutal? You haven't heard about the Byzantine Empire in the 12th century. While Western Europe was still figuring out basic castle construction, the Byzantines had turned political punishment into an art form that would make modern dictators take notes. We're talking about a civilization that discovered the perfect balance between keeping enemies alive and making sure they could never threaten you again. Picture this. You're dragged through the streets of Constantinople in heavy iron chains, the jeering crowd throwing rotten vegetables at your face while you stumble toward the hippodrome. The emperor waits for you there, sitting on his golden throne, wearing a smile that promises unspeakable horrors. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This actually happened, repeatedly, throughout the 12th century Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine approach to dealing with political rivals wasn't just creative, it was theologically justified. These weren't random acts of cruelty by psychopathic rulers. This was a systematic method of political control that lasted for centuries and shaped the fate of one of history's most powerful empires. Today we're diving deep into the darkest chapter of Byzantine politics, where chains weren't just used to restrain prisoners, but became instruments of public humiliation that preceded punishments so horrific they'd make medieval torture devices look merciful. By the end of this video, you'll understand how an empire that produced some of history's greatest military victories and architectural marvels simultaneously perfected techniques of political brutality that would influence authoritarian regimes for centuries to come. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how sophisticated this system really was. The 12th century marked the golden age of what historians call the Komnenian Restoration. Three emperors transformed the Byzantine Empire from near collapse into the Mediterranean's dominant superpower. Alexios I Komnenos seized power in 1081 and began an astonishing reversal of imperial fortunes that his descendants continued for over a century. His son John II, known as John the Beautiful, expanded this success while maintaining a reputation for unusual mercy. Then came Manuel I, who pushed Byzantine influence to heights not seen since the days of Justinian. But beneath this glittering facade of military triumph and cultural achievement lay a political system built on systematic terror. The Byzantines had discovered something Western Europe hadn't figured out yet: how to neutralize political enemies without creating martyrs. While medieval kings in France and England were still chopping off heads and dealing with rebellious nobles, Byzantine emperors had developed a method that was infinitely more cruel and infinitely more effective. The secret lay in their understanding of what made an emperor legitimate in Byzantine culture. Unlike Western Europe, where might often made right, the Byzantine Empire operated on the principle that the emperor was God's representative on earth. This wasn't just political propaganda. It was theological doctrine that shaped every aspect of imperial law. Since God was perfect, the emperor also had to be unblemished. Any physical defect, especially facial disfigurement, would disqualify someone from holding imperial power forever. This created a brilliant solution to the eternal problem of political rivals. Instead of executing enemies and potentially creating martyrs whose supporters could rally around their memory, Byzantine emperors could simply mutilate them. A blinded rival couldn't lead armies into battle. A castrated enemy could never father heirs to threaten the dynasty. A man with his nose cut off could never sit on the imperial throne, no matter how much popular support he commanded. The Byzantines convinced themselves this was actually merciful. Contemporary sources describe mutilation as a form of Christian compassion, since only God should take a human life. They were preserving their enemies' souls while eliminating their political threat. It was theological justification for political brutality, wrapped in the language of divine mercy. But the real genius wasn't in the mutilation itself. It was in the theatre surrounding it. Byzantine political punishments were carefully orchestrated public spectacles designed to maximize psychological impact on both the victim and the watching crowd. This is where those chains come into the story. When Justinian II, known as the Slit-Nosed, regained power in 705 after 10 years of exile, he provided the template for how chains would be used in Byzantine political theatre. His predecessors, Leontius and Tiberius III, weren't just executed quietly in some palace dungeon. They were dragged through Constantinople in heavy iron chains, forced to crawl before the emperor in the packed hippodrome, while thousands of spectators cheered. Justinian, now wearing a golden prosthetic nose to replace the one his enemies had cut off, placed his feet on their necks in a ritual act of dominance before ordering their beheading. The chains weren't just practical restraints, they were symbols of complete subjugation. Every link represented the emperor's absolute power over life and death, the total reversal of political fortune that could happen to anyone who dared challenge imperial authority. This wasn't a one-time event. It established a pattern that would be repeated throughout Byzantine history, reaching its most systematic expression during the 12th century. The process became almost bureaucratic in its precision. Political enemies would be captured, bound in chains, and paraded through the capital in carefully planned processions designed to demonstrate imperial justice while entertaining the masses. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a Byzantine noble watching your former ally or family member dragged past your house in chains, knowing that tomorrow it could be you. The chains created a visceral connection between the observer and the victim, a reminder that political loyalty in Byzantium wasn't just expected, it was enforced through methods that guaranteed compliance through terror. What made this system particularly effective was its unpredictability. Unlike Western European feudalism, where political relationships were governed by relatively clear obligations and expectations, Byzantine politics operated in an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. An emperor's favor could shift overnight, turning trusted advisors into chained prisoners awaiting mutilation. The 12th century emperors perfected this system, while simultaneously building one of history's most successful empires. Alexios I established the framework by creating an extended family network that supposedly eliminated the need for widespread political violence. By marrying into powerful noble families and co-opting potential rivals through kinship ties, he tried to create a system where loyalty was rewarded with inclusion rather than enforced through fear. This approach worked brilliantly during the reigns of Alexios I and his immediate successors, but it contained the seeds of its own destruction. As the imperial family network expanded, so did the number of potential claimants to the throne. What started as a solution to political instability gradually became its primary source. John II Komnenos stands out as a remarkable exception to Byzantine political norms. Known as John the Good, he reportedly never condemned anyone to death or mutilation during his entire 25-year reign. Contemporary sources describe him as the Byzantine Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher-emperor whose personal morality influenced an entire generation of imperial administrators. But John's merciful approach created its own problems. By refusing to eliminate potential threats through traditional methods, he allowed rival factions to grow stronger while appearing weak to those who expected imperial authority to be enforced through decisive action. His restraint, while morally admirable, may have contributed to the political instability that would eventually destroy the Komnenian system. Manuel I continued his father's relatively moderate approach while expanding Byzantine influence throughout the Mediterranean world. His reign marked the last flowering of Komnenian power, with the empire achieving a level of prosperity and international prestige that hadn't been seen for centuries. But Manuel's focus on external expansion left internal political problems unresolved. The succession crisis following Manuel's death in 1180 shattered the careful balance that had maintained Komnenian stability for nearly a century. His son Alexios II was only 11 years old, leaving the empire under the regency of his mother, Maria of Antioch. Her Norman French origins made her deeply unpopular with the Constantinople mob, while rival factions within the extended imperial family began maneuvering for control. This power vacuum created the perfect conditions for the return of political violence on a scale not seen since the early days of the dynasty. The moderate approach that had worked so well under John II and Manuel suddenly seemed inadequate for dealing with the multiple threats facing the empire. Traditional Byzantine methods of political control were about to make a dramatic and bloody comeback. The man who would bring them back was Andronikos I Komnenos, Manuel's cousin and one of the most controversial figures in Byzantine history. His rise to power marked the beginning of the end for the Komnenian dynasty and initiated a period of political terror that would ultimately destroy the empire's social cohesion. Andronikos had spent decades in exile, watching the empire from afar while plotting his return to power. When the succession crisis provided his opportunity, he moved with ruthless efficiency. In 1182, he rode into Constantinople at the head of a popular uprising that massacred the city's Latin population and eliminated his immediate rivals. But Andronikos wasn't content with simply seizing power. He was determined to reshape Byzantine politics according to his own vision, and that vision included a return to the systematic use of mutilation and public humiliation as tools of imperial control. The chains came out almost immediately after Andronikos consolidated his grip on the throne. Unlike his predecessors who had tried to rule through family alliances and political accommodation, Andronikos believed that fear was the only reliable foundation for imperial authority. He had watched decades of Komnenian moderation create the very instability that allowed him to seize power, and he was determined not to repeat their mistakes. His first targets were members of his own extended family. The Komnenian system had created dozens of potential imperial claimants, each with their own network of supporters and their own dreams of power. Andronikos saw them not as relatives to be accommodated, but as threats to be eliminated. The iron chains that had once been reserved for foreign enemies and common criminals now became the standard restraint for Byzantine princes and princesses. The transformation was swift and terrifying. Palace servants who had grown accustomed to the civilized atmosphere of Manuel's court suddenly found themselves witnessing scenes of brutality that belonged in the darkest chapters of Byzantine history. Nobles who had spent their entire lives navigating the complex web of imperial family politics discovered that the old rules no longer applied. Andronikos developed what can only be described as an industrial approach to political mutilation. Rather than the sporadic violence that had characterized earlier reigns, his administration created systematic procedures for processing political prisoners. The chains became part of a carefully choreographed sequence of humiliation that began with arrest and culminated in public disfigurement. The process typically started at dawn. Imperial guards would arrive at a suspect's residence with official writs of arrest. But these weren't the polite summons that had been common during Manuel's reign. These were military operations designed to maximize psychological impact on both the target and anyone who witnessed the arrest. The suspect would be dragged from their home in heavy iron shackles that had been deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. The chains were longer than necessary, forcing prisoners to shuffle rather than walk normally. The extra length also created a distinctive rattling sound that announced the approach of imperial justice long before the procession came into view. But the real innovation was in the route these processions took through Constantinople. Rather than taking direct paths to the imperial palace or the hippodrome, Andronikos ordered his guards to parade chained prisoners through the most crowded districts of the capital. The processions became mobile exhibitions of imperial power, designed to remind every citizen of what happened to those who opposed the emperor's will. The crowds that gathered to watch these spectacles weren't passive observers. Byzantine political culture encouraged active participation in imperial justice, and the mob's reaction often influenced the severity of the punishment that followed. Prisoners who were genuinely unpopular might face a barrage of stones and rotten food, while those who retained some public sympathy might be met with uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes about popular opinion. Andronikos understood this dynamic perfectly. He deliberately timed these processions to maximize attendance, often scheduling them during market hours when the streets were packed with merchants, artisans, and ordinary citizens. The chains weren't just restraining the prisoners, they were binding the entire population into complicity with imperial terror. The psychological warfare extended to the families of the accused. Wives, children, and siblings were often forced to watch as their loved ones were dragged through the streets in chains. Some were required to attend the subsequent trials and punishments, creating a form of collective trauma that spread far beyond the immediate victims. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that would have been unthinkable during the moderate reigns of John II and Manuel I. Byzantine chroniclers, normally restrained in their language, used words like unprecedented and inhuman to describe what they witnessed. Foreign visitors to Constantinople during this period left detailed accounts of a city living under a reign of terror that surpassed anything they had seen in their own supposedly barbaric homelands. The chains themselves became objects of fascination and horror. craftsmen were commissioned to create special restraints for high-ranking prisoners, with different designs indicating the social status of the victim. Members of the imperial family received chains made from precious metals, a grotesque parody of the golden ornaments they had once worn as symbols of their elevated position. Lower-ranking nobles were shackled in iron chains that were deliberately allowed to rust, creating rough surfaces that chafed against the skin during the long processions through the city. Common criminals received the heaviest chains, crude iron links that could weigh up to 50 pounds and made walking nearly impossible. But Andronikos's most diabolical innovation was the introduction of what contemporary sources called memory chains. These were lighter restraints used specifically for prisoners who were being taken to their mutilation rather than their execution. The reduced weight allowed the victims to move more naturally, ensuring that they would be fully conscious and aware during the ordeal that awaited them. The emperor personally supervised many of these processions, appearing at palace balconies or specially constructed viewing platforms to observe the humiliation of his enemies. His presence transformed what might have been routine police actions into imperial ceremonies, complete with formal protocols and ritualized gestures of submission. Witnesses described how Andronikos would nod approvingly when a chained prisoner stumbled or fell, treating these moments of degradation as entertainment rather than necessary evils. He developed a reputation for studying the faces of prisoners as they passed beneath his viewing platform, apparently deriving pleasure from their expressions of fear and despair. The systematic nature of this cruelty extended to the record-keeping. Imperial scribes maintained detailed logs of who had been chained, when, and for what offense. These documents, some of which survived the eventual collapse of Andronikos's regime, reveal the bureaucratic precision with which political terror was administered. The logs include notes about the effectiveness of different chain configurations, observations about crowd reactions to various types of processions, and even cost analyses comparing the expense of different restraint systems. This wasn't random violence born of imperial rage. It was calculated psychological warfare conducted with the efficiency of a government department. The impact on Byzantine society was devastating. The moderate political culture that had flourished under the early Komnenian emperors disappeared almost overnight. Nobles who had once engaged in spirited political debates now spoke in whispers, afraid that any criticism might be interpreted as treason. The extended family networks that had been the foundation of Komnenian power began to fragment as relatives turned against each other to avoid imperial suspicion. The chain processions became so frequent that they disrupted normal economic activity in Constantinople. Merchants complained that the constant parade of prisoners through commercial districts was driving away customers. Artisans found it difficult to concentrate on their work when the rattling of chains and the jeers of crowds interrupted their daily routines. But perhaps the most insidious effect was the way these spectacles normalized extreme violence. Citizens who had once been shocked by occasional executions gradually became accustomed to regular displays of systematic brutality. Children grew up thinking that chained processions followed by public mutilation were simply part of normal imperial government. The international reaction was swift and damaging. Foreign ambassadors who had once competed for invitations to the glittering court of Manuel I now avoided Constantinople entirely. Trade relationships that had taken decades to build collapsed as Western European merchants refused to do business with an empire that had become synonymous with barbaric cruelty. The reputation for extreme violence that Andronikos cultivated through his chain processions would ultimately contribute to the success of the Fourth Crusade. When Western European armies arrived at the gates of Constantinople in 1204, they justified their assault on the city by pointing to the systematic brutality of its rulers. The chains that had been used to terrorize political prisoners became symbols of Byzantine tyranny that legitimized foreign conquest. But all of this was still in the future, as Andronikos consolidated his power through increasingly elaborate displays of cruelty. The emperor who had once been content to simply eliminate his rivals now seemed determined to break the spirit of anyone who might dare to oppose him. The chains were no longer just practical restraints or symbols of imperial authority. They had become instruments of psychological warfare designed to reshape Byzantine political culture through fear. The transformation was so complete that even Andronikos's supporters began to question whether he had gone too far. Palace insiders who had initially welcomed his strong leadership started to worry that the emperor's obsession with chains and public humiliation was creating more enemies than it eliminated. But by then, the machinery of imperial terror had taken on a momentum of its own, and stopping it would prove far more difficult than starting it had been. The machinery of terror that Andronikos had unleashed required constant feeding, and the emperor found himself trapped in a cycle of escalating brutality that he could no longer control. What had begun as calculated political strategy gradually transformed into something resembling addiction. Each successful humiliation of a rival demanded an even more spectacular follow-up. Each chain procession needed to surpass the previous one in its cruelty and theatrical impact. The emperor's inner circle watched with growing alarm as their master became increasingly obsessed with the technical details of prisoner restraint and public degradation. Palace meetings that should have focused on military campaigns or economic policy instead devolved into lengthy discussions about optimal chain lengths, crowd management strategies, and the psychological effects of different types of public humiliation. Andronikos began commissioning detailed studies of how various restraint methods affected prisoner behavior during their final march to mutilation. He wanted to know which chain configurations produced the most visible fear, which walking speeds maximized crowd engagement, and how different routes through the city influenced public reaction to imperial justice. This wasn't governance anymore. It was performance art using human suffering as the medium. The emperor's fascination extended to the architectural aspects of his terror campaigns. He ordered modifications to key buildings along prisoner routes, installing special viewing platforms and acoustic features designed to amplify the sounds of rattling chains and crowd reactions. The very structure of Constantinople was being reshaped to serve as a stage for imperial brutality. Palace craftsmen found themselves receiving increasingly bizarre commissions from their imperial patron. Andronikos wanted chains that would photograph well in the bright Mediterranean sunlight, restraints that would create specific visual effects when prisoners moved, and shackles designed to produce particular sounds when dragged across different types of stone paving. The emperor's attention to these details revealed something deeply disturbing about his psychological state. This wasn't the calculated cruelty of a pragmatic ruler eliminating political threats. This was the methodical obsession of someone who had discovered that inflicting suffering could become an end in itself rather than merely a means to political control. Court physicians began to worry about their emperor's mental health as he spent entire nights poring over reports from previous chain processions, making detailed notes about crowd reactions and prisoner behavior. He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of how different types of restraints affected human movement, which routes through the city produced the most dramatic visual impact, and how various forms of preliminary torture influenced the spectacle of the final march to mutilation. But Andronikos wasn't content to limit his innovations to chains and processions. He began experimenting with increasingly elaborate forms of preliminary humiliation designed to maximize the psychological impact of the eventual punishment. Prisoners might be forced to wear deliberately degrading costumes during their march through the city, or subjected to ritualized mockery that referenced their former positions of power and prestige. High-ranking nobles, who had once dined at the imperial table, found themselves dressed in rags and forced to carry signs listing their alleged crimes. Members of the imperial family were made to wear crowns of thorns or chains, fashioned into grotesque parodies of royal regalia. Former military commanders were dragged through the streets in the remnants of their dress uniforms, now torn and stained with deliberate precision to maximize the contrast with their former glory. The emperor's creativity in devising these humiliations seemed limitless. He established what amounted to a department of degradation within the imperial administration, staffed by officials whose sole responsibility was designing increasingly elaborate methods of psychological torture for political prisoners. These bureaucrats of brutality maintained detailed files on each victim, noting their personal fears, family relationships, and sources of pride, so that the humiliation could be precisely targeted for maximum emotional impact. The ripple effects of this systematic cruelty extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The entire social fabric of Byzantine society began to unravel as people realized that no amount of loyalty or service could guarantee protection from imperial wrath. Nobles who had spent their lives navigating court politics suddenly found that the old rules no longer applied, while common citizens lived in constant fear that some minor infraction might bring them to the emperor's attention. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Constantinople had long been one of the Mediterranean's greatest commercial centers, but the constant parade of chained prisoners through its streets was driving away the foreign merchants who had been essential to its prosperity. Trade routes that had operated for centuries began to shift away from Byzantine ports as word spread about the emperor's reign of terror. International diplomatic relationships that had taken generations to build collapsed almost overnight. Foreign ambassadors who had once competed for access to the Byzantine court now avoided Constantinople entirely, viewing assignment to the empire as equivalent to exile to a realm of madness and brutality. The sophisticated diplomatic network that had been one of Byzantium's greatest strengths simply evaporated, as other nations concluded that the empire had become too unpredictable and dangerous to deal with. Religious leaders within the empire found themselves in an impossible position. The Orthodox Church had long provided theological justification for imperial authority, but Andronikos's excesses strained even the most flexible interpretations of Christian doctrine. Bishops who had once blessed imperial decisions now struggled to reconcile their faith with the systematic brutality they witnessed daily in their capital. Some clergy attempted to intervene, approaching the emperor privately to counsel moderation and remind him of Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness. These well-intentioned efforts typically resulted in the religious leaders themselves becoming targets of imperial suspicion. Several prominent bishops found themselves accused of treason for questioning imperial policy, leading to the grotesque spectacle of religious figures being dragged through Constantinople in chains before facing mutilation for the crime of advocating Christian compassion. The emperor's response to clerical criticism revealed the depth of his psychological transformation. Rather than viewing religious opposition as a sign that he had gone too far, Andronikos interpreted it as evidence of a vast conspiracy against his rule. He began to see enemies everywhere, including among those who had been most loyal to his cause. This paranoia led to an acceleration of the terror rather than its moderation. The emperor concluded that his previous efforts had been insufficient, that he needed to demonstrate his power even more dramatically to crush the opposition he believed was growing around him. The chain processions became longer and more frequent, the preliminary humiliations more elaborate and degrading, the final punishments more creative in their cruelty. Palace insiders, who had initially supported Andronikos's strong leadership, began to realize they had unleashed something they could not control. The emperor they had helped bring to power was no longer the calculating politician they had backed, but something approaching a monster whose appetite for inflicting suffering seemed to grow with each feeding. Secret meetings began to take place among the remaining members of the imperial administration, whispered conversations about whether something could be done to moderate the emperor's behavior or, failing that, to remove him from power entirely. But these discussions were conducted in an atmosphere of absolute terror, as everyone knew that discovery would mean joining the endless parade of chained prisoners making their way to mutilation and death. The emperor's network of informers had grown so extensive that virtually no conversation in Constantinople could be considered truly private. Servants reported on their masters, children informed on their parents, and spouses betrayed each other in desperate attempts to demonstrate their loyalty to the imperial regime. The social bonds that had held Byzantine society together for centuries were dissolving under the corrosive effects of systematic fear. Even the emperor's own family members were not immune from suspicion. Andronikos began to view his relatives not as allies in maintaining imperial power, but as potential threats who might use their royal blood to justify rebellion against his rule. The extended family network that had been the foundation of Komnenian's strength became another source of paranoid anxiety for the emperor. One by one, members of the imperial family found themselves subjected to the same treatment that had been reserved for common criminals and foreign enemies. The sight of Byzantine princes and princesses being dragged through Constantinople in chains shocked even those citizens who had become accustomed to the emperor's cruelty. The message was unmistakable. No one was safe from imperial wrath, regardless of their blood relationship to the throne. The psychological impact of seeing members of the royal family subjected to such degradation was profound. If imperial relatives could be chained and mutilated for suspected disloyalty, what hope did ordinary citizens have of avoiding a similar fate? The fear that had initially been confined to political elites began to permeate every level of Byzantine society. Children grew up thinking that public torture was a normal part of government administration. Young people who should have been learning trades or preparing for careers instead spent their formative years watching elaborate displays of imperial cruelty. The long-term cultural damage of this exposure to systematic violence would influence Byzantine society for generations, even after Andronikos himself had been removed from power. The emperor's obsession with chains and public humiliation began to consume so much of his attention that other aspects of imperial administration suffered severe neglect. Military campaigns were postponed while the emperor focused on designing new forms of prisoner restraint. Economic policies went unimplemented as imperial resources were diverted to support the growing infrastructure of terror. Foreign enemies of the empire began to take notice of this internal dysfunction. The military reputation that had been built up during the successful reigns of Alexios, John, and Manuel was rapidly eroding, as potential adversaries realized that the current emperor was more interested in torturing his own subjects than in defending imperial borders. The decline in military effectiveness became apparent when several provincial rebellions broke out simultaneously, stretching imperial forces beyond their capacity to respond. Instead of focusing on these external threats, Andronikos became convinced that the rebellions were part of a coordinated conspiracy orchestrated by the prisoners he had already captured and mutilated. This delusion led him to intensify his reign of terror rather than address the real military challenges facing the empire. The emperor's inability to distinguish between genuine security threats and imaginary conspiracies resulted in a vicious cycle of escalating violence. Each new rebellion was interpreted as proof that previous punishments had been too lenient, leading to even more elaborate displays of cruelty that further alienated the population and created additional sources of opposition to imperial rule. As the empire's internal situation continued to deteriorate, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Andronikos himself, but the future of the entire Byzantine Empire. The chains that had been used to terrorize political prisoners were about to become symbols of the empire's own bondage to a system of governance that had spiraled completely out of control. The machinery of terror that Andronikos had created with such careful attention to detail was about to turn against its creator, but not before claiming thousands more victims in an orgy of violence that would scar Byzantine civilization for centuries to come. The emperor, who had sought to use fear as the foundation of absolute power, was about to discover that terror, once unleashed, recognizes no master and acknowledges no limits. The final chapter of Andronikos's reign began not with the dramatic rebellion you might expect, but with something far more prosaic: a shortage of chains. The emperor's obsession with elaborate prisoner processions had created such demand for specialized restraints that Constantinople's metalworkers couldn't keep up with imperial orders. Blacksmiths who had once crafted armor and weapons now found themselves working around the clock to produce the increasingly complex shackles that Andronikos demanded for his political theater. This seemingly minor logistical problem revealed the absurd extremes to which the emperor's reign of terror had evolved. Palace administrators were spending more time coordinating chain procurement than managing the empire's finances. Military resources were being diverted to transport prisoners rather than defend borders. The Byzantine Empire, once the Mediterranean's most sophisticated civilization, had transformed itself into a grotesque machine whose primary function was the systematic degradation of its own citizens. But the chain shortage created an unexpected opportunity for those plotting against the emperor. When palace officials began recruiting additional metalworkers to meet imperial demands, they inadvertently provided cover for conspirators to meet and coordinate their plans. Secret messages were passed between blacksmith shops under the pretense of discussing technical specifications for prisoner restraints. The very infrastructure that Andronikos had created to terrorize his subjects became the network through which his downfall was orchestrated. The irony wasn't lost on the conspirators who gathered in the smoky workshops where chains were forged. They understood that the emperor's greatest weakness was also his greatest obsession. Andronikos had become so focused on perfecting the theatrical aspects of his terror campaigns that he had lost sight of the basic requirements of imperial governance. While he spent hours designing new forms of prisoner humiliation, actual threats to the empire were multiplying beyond his capacity to address them. The man who would ultimately bring down Andronikos was Isaac Angelos, a relatively minor member of the imperial nobility, who had managed to avoid attracting the emperor's attention through a combination of careful political maneuvering and deliberate insignificance. Isaac had watched the systematic destruction of Byzantine political culture with growing alarm, but he was smart enough to realize that open opposition would only result in his own appearance in one of those dreaded chain processions. Instead, Isaac began building a network of supporters among those who had been personally affected by Andronikos's reign of terror. This wasn't difficult, since by 1185, virtually every prominent family in Constantinople had lost at least one member to imperial paranoia. The emperor's systematic elimination of potential rivals had created a vast pool of people with personal reasons to hate the current regime and powerful motivations to support change. The conspiracy that formed around Isaac was unlike typical Byzantine palace coups. Rather than relying on military commanders or foreign allies, it drew its strength from the very people who had been terrorized by Andronikos's chain processions. Craftsmen who had been forced to create instruments of torture, servants who had witnessed unspeakable cruelties, merchants whose businesses had been destroyed by the emperor's policies, all found common cause in their desire to end the reign of terror. The plan that emerged was elegantly simple. Rather than attempting to assassinate Andronikos directly, which would have been nearly impossible given his extensive security precautions, the conspirators decided to wait for the right moment to turn the emperor's own methods against him. They would use the very spectacle of imperial justice that Andronikos had perfected to demonstrate his weakness and rally popular support for regime change. The opportunity came in September 1185, when the emperor's paranoia reached new heights following reports of yet another provincial rebellion. Andronikos ordered the arrest of several prominent nobles on charges of treason, including Isaac Angelos himself. But instead of submitting to arrest and joining the endless parade of chained prisoners, Isaac chose to make his stand in the most sacred space in Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia. When imperial guards arrived to arrest him, Isaac killed their commander and took sanctuary in the great cathedral. This act of defiance, witnessed by hundreds of worshippers, transformed him instantly from a minor nobleman into a symbol of resistance against imperial tyranny. The sight of someone finally standing up to Andronikos's terror machine electrified the population in ways that the emperor's carefully orchestrated displays of cruelty never could. The crowd that gathered around the Hagia Sophia wasn't the usual mob that assembled to watch chain processions and public mutilations. These were ordinary citizens who had endured years of systematic fear and were finally seeing someone willing to fight back. The energy was completely different from the nervous excitement that typically surrounded imperial executions. This was genuine popular uprising, fueled by years of accumulated rage against a regime that had made terror its primary instrument of governance. Andronikos's response revealed just how completely his reign of terror had undermined his own position. Instead of rallying to defend their emperor, the palace guards began defecting to Isaac's cause. The military commanders who should have been the regime's strongest supporters were among the first to abandon Andronikos once they realized the tide was turning. The systematic elimination of potential rivals had left the emperor with no reliable allies when he finally faced a genuine threat to his power. The emperor, who had spent years perfecting the art of public humiliation, suddenly found himself the target of the very techniques he had pioneered. As Isaac's supporters gained control of Constantinople, they began hunting for Andronikos with the same methodical efficiency that the emperor had once used to track down his enemies. The irony was perfect. The man who had terrorized others through elaborate displays of imperial justice was now experiencing the fear and desperation that he had inflicted on thousands of victims. When Andronikos was finally captured, the conspirators faced a crucial decision about how to handle his punishment. They could have simply executed him quietly, ending the reign of terror with minimal additional violence, but the psychological damage that the emperor had inflicted on Byzantine society demanded a more dramatic resolution. The people of Constantinople needed to see their tormentor subjected to the same treatment he had imposed on others. The chain procession that followed was the most elaborate and well-attended in Byzantine history. Every detail that Andronikos had perfected for terrorizing his enemies was now turned against him with surgical precision. The emperor, who had spent years studying crowd psychology and theatrical impact, found himself the unwilling star of the ultimate performance, a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed for generations. The crowds that lined the streets for Andronikos's final procession were unlike any that had gathered for previous imperial punishments. These weren't the nervous spectators who had watched earlier chain processions in fearful silence, wondering if they might be next. These were people celebrating the end of a nightmare, citizens who could finally express their rage against a regime that had made their lives a constant source of terror. The sound of Andronikos's chains dragging across the stones of Constantinople created a symphony of justice that resonated through every district of the capital. Each rattle and clang represented the liberation of a population that had been held hostage by their own emperor's psychological warfare. The very techniques that Andronikos had used to break the spirit of his enemies were now serving to heal the collective trauma he had inflicted on Byzantine society. But the most significant aspect of Andronikos's downfall wasn't the elaborate nature of his punishment, but what it revealed about the fundamental instability of ruling through terror alone. The emperor, who had believed that fear was the most reliable foundation for political power, discovered that systematic cruelty ultimately generates its own opposition. By eliminating moderate voices and reasonable alternatives, Andronikos had created conditions where violent revolution became the only viable path to political change. The collapse of his regime demonstrated that the Byzantine system of political mutilation, for all its theological justification and psychological sophistication, contained fatal flaws that made it unsustainable in the long term. While it could effectively neutralize individual threats to imperial power, it could not address the fundamental problems of governance that required cooperation, trust, and institutional stability, rather than fear and intimidation. Isaac Angelos's victory marked the end of the Komnenian dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in Byzantine history. But the damage that Andronikos had inflicted on imperial institutions and social relationships would prove far more difficult to repair than anyone initially realized. The systematic use of terror as a tool of governance had created deep wounds in Byzantine civilization that would influence the empire's development for centuries to come. The chains that had once symbolized imperial power and divine justice were finally being removed, but the psychological shackles that Andronikos had placed on Byzantine society would prove far more difficult to break. The emperor, who had sought to use fear as the ultimate political weapon, had succeeded in demonstrating its limitations, but the cost of that lesson would be paid by generations of his successors who inherited an empire traumatized by its encounter with systematic terror. The fall of Andronikos represented more than just the end of a particularly brutal reign. It marked the moment when the Byzantine Empire began its long, slow slide toward eventual collapse. The political and social damage inflicted by the systematic use of chains, public humiliation, and psychological warfare had weakened the empire's foundations in ways that would become apparent only gradually over the following decades. As Isaac Angelos established his new regime, he faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding institutions and relationships that had been systematically destroyed by his predecessor's reign of terror. The question that would define the remaining centuries of Byzantine history was whether an empire that had fallen so completely under the spell of systematic cruelty could ever fully recover its former greatness, or whether the chains that had bound Andronikos's victims had also bound the empire itself to a future shaped by the dark legacy of the 12th century's most notorious emperor. The answer to that question came sooner than anyone expected. Isaac Angelos proved to be everything that Andronikos was not: merciful where his predecessor had been cruel, trusting where Andronikos had been paranoid, and genuinely committed to healing the wounds that systematic terror had inflicted on Byzantine society. But these admirable qualities, which made him beloved by a population desperate for relief from fear, also made him vulnerable to the very threats that Andronikos had tried to eliminate through brutality. Within months of taking power, Isaac faced the harsh reality that dismantling a system of terror is far more complicated than establishing one. The extensive network of informers and secret police that Andronikos had created didn't simply disappear with their master's death. These people had built careers and accumulated power through their participation in the Reign of Terror, and they had little interest in returning to obscurity under a more moderate regime. Isaac's decision to grant amnesty to most of Andronikos's collaborators, while morally admirable, created practical problems that would plague his entire reign. Former torturers and executioners found themselves living alongside the families of their victims, creating an atmosphere of unresolved tension that undermined the social harmony Isaac was trying to restore. The emperor, who wanted to heal his empire through forgiveness, discovered that some wounds run too deep for simple reconciliation. More troubling was Isaac's inability to address the fundamental structural problems that had made Andronikos's rise possible in the first place. The extended family networks that had been the foundation of Komnenian power lay in ruins, destroyed by years of systematic persecution. The military leadership had been decimated, with competent commanders either dead, mutilated, or fled to foreign courts. The economic disruption caused by years of political instability had left the imperial treasury nearly empty. Isaac tried to compensate for these weaknesses by embracing exactly the kind of inclusive, consensus-building approach that Andronikos had rejected. He restored confiscated properties, recalled political exiles, and attempted to rebuild the complex web of alliances that had made earlier Byzantine emperors so successful. But these efforts required time and stability that the empire no longer possessed. The international situation had deteriorated dramatically during Andronikos's reign of terror. The massacre of Latin residents in Constantinople had poisoned relationships with Western Europe at precisely the moment when crusading armies were looking for new targets. The diplomatic isolation that had resulted from systematic brutality left Isaac with few allies and many enemies, just as external threats to the empire were multiplying. So there you have it, the Byzantine Empire's dark experiment with chains, terror, and systematic brutality. What started as a sophisticated method of political control ended up destroying the very civilization it was meant to protect. The emperors who thought they could rule through fear discovered that terror is like a wildfire. Once you light it, you can't control where it spreads or when it stops burning. The chains that dragged political prisoners through Constantinople's streets became the empire's own shackles, binding it to a cycle of violence that would ultimately lead to its downfall when the Fourth Crusade arrived in 1204. Sometimes the most effective weapon against your enemies becomes the very thing that destroys you.